That weekend remains one of the most unsettling, yet strangely exhilarating periods of my life. It all began on a quiet Friday evening when Mom left for her business trip. I never gave much thought to Dad and me being alone together. It was a normal part of life. Mom's job frequently took her out of town, and Dad was always the one holding down the fort. We'd typically spend those weekends doing what fathers and sons often do: fishing, watching football, or sometimes just quietly coexisting in the same space. It had never felt awkward or unusual until it did. It started on one of those typical weekends when Mom was away for work. It was a Friday evening, and the house was enveloped in its usual stillness. Dad was in the kitchen preparing dinner, his movements slow and deliberate, as if lost in his thoughts. I sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels, feeling listless. The quiet was initially comforting, familiar in the way all our weekends together had always been. But this time, there was a different energy in the air, something intangible and unsettling. "Dinner's ready," Dad called from the kitchen, breaking the silence. I dragged myself to the table, the aroma of his homemade spaghetti filling the room. We ate in silence for a few minutes, but the quiet felt heavier than usual. It wasn't as if Dad and I were ever big talkers, but tonight the silence felt tense. So he began clearing his throat. "How's school been?" "Fine," I replied, avoiding his gaze. Dad was never one for extended conversations, especially about school, so the question felt out of place. I glanced at him across the table and noticed something in his eyes, a new intensity that made me uneasy. I dismissed it, thinking he was probably just tired from work. He nodded, taking another bite of food. "You're what now, 16? 17. He nodded again, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long. I shifted in my seat, suddenly feeling self-conscious, as if I were under scrutiny. He didn't speak after that, and we finished dinner in silence. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the house felt too quiet. I usually enjoyed the silence, but this time it made me feel uneasy. I kept replaying the way Dad had looked at me across the dinner table, how his gaze seemed to linger, as if he were trying to decipher something. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, things became even stranger. I woke up to find Dad in the kitchen again, making breakfast. His demeanor was different, more relaxed than usual. He wore his old t-shirt and pajama bottoms, leaning against the counter as he flipped pancakes. "Morning," he said, flashing me a smile. It wasn't his usual dad smile. It felt warmer, more personal. "Morning," I replied, my voice more guarded than I intended. I grabbed a plate and sat at the table, trying not to look at him directly. He joined me, sitting a little too close for comfort. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and it made my heart race inexplicably. "Got any plans today?" he asked, his voice casual yet with an underlying tension. I shrugged. "Not really. Just thought I'd hang out at home." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Maybe we could spend some time together. Just the two of us, like we used to." My pulse quickened. "Yeah, sure. What did you have in mind?" "Anything. Whatever you want," he said, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my stomach churn. I tried to act normal, but the tension was palpable. It wasn't anything overt. He hadn't done or said anything explicitly wrong. But there was a shift in the dynamic between us that I couldn't ignore. The easygoing weekends we used to share now felt heavy, laden with unspoken something. The day crawled by with me attempting to avoid being alone with Dad. But it was impossible. He kept finding excuses to be near me, helping me with tasks I hadn't requested, sitting too close on the couch when we watched TV, his hand brushing mine as he passed me the remote. Every touch felt deliberate, increasing my discomfort. That night, after I'd gone to bed, I lay awake for what felt like hours. My mind raced, replaying every interaction from the day, trying to understand what was happening. Was I imagining things, or was Dad acting differently? The sound of footsteps outside my door startled me. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped just outside my room. There was a soft knock, and then the door creaked open. "Hey." Dad's voice was low, barely a whisper. "Are you still awake?" I didn't answer immediately. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the tension building in the air. "Yeah," I finally replied, my voice shaky. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air thick with an unspoken tension. "I was just checking on you," he said, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "You okay?" I nodded, though I felt anything but okay. "Yeah, I'm fine." He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the side of my bed. My breath caught in my throat as he sat down on the edge, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" His voice was soft, almost soothing, but it did nothing to ease the anxiety churning inside me. "I know," I whispered, wishing he would leave. But he didn't. He stayed there, his hand resting. His presence was overwhelming, my body tense, every muscle rigid as I waited for him to say or do something that would make this moment comprehensible. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. It was the lightest of touches, barely there, yet it sent a shiver through me. I froze, unsure how to react, what to say. Dad? My voice was barely a whisper, my mind racing with a million incoherent thoughts. He didn't move, didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he pulled his hand away and stood up. "Good night," he said quietly, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with my swirling thoughts. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with confusion and fear. Something had shifted between us, something undeniable, and the uncertainty terrified me. But there was more, much more. The days following that strange night were filled with a heavy silence, as if we both acknowledged the change but were too afraid to address it. Dad and I went through our usual routines, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Every glance, every touch, even the smallest interactions felt loaded, like we were treading on thin ice, unsure when it would crack. The weekend passed slowly. Mom called a few times, chatting cheerfully about her trip, completely oblivious to the strange atmosphere that had permeated the house. Dad would answer the phone, his voice steady, betraying nothing. But every time he hung up, the silence would return, suffocating us both. It wasn't until Tuesday evening, when Mom was due back the following day, that everything came to a head. It was late, past midnight, and I couldn't sleep. I'd spent the last few nights tossing and turning, my mind replaying the moment when Dad had sat on the edge of my bed, the way his hand had lingered on my arm. I couldn't shake the premonition that something was about to happen, that we were on the verge of something dangerous. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps outside my door. My heart began to race, my body tensing as the footsteps drew closer. I knew it was Dad. I'd known it would be him the moment I heard the first creak of the floorboard. The door opened slowly, and there he was, standing in the doorway, just like a few nights before. But this time, there was no hesitation in his movements. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. "Hey," he said softly, his voice slightly hoarse. "You awake?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah." He didn't speak for a moment, just stood there looking at me. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, undeniable and potent. Finally, he walked over to the bed and sat down, just as he had the other night. The mattress dipped under his weight, and I felt the familiar anxiety settle in my chest. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "About us." The word sent a shiver down my spine. "About what?" He looked at me, his eyes shadowed in the darkness. "The way things have been lately, the way we've been." I didn't know what to say, so I remained silent, my heart pounding in my chest, the tension building as if the room were shrinking around us. Dad reached out then, his hand finding mine under the blanket. The touch was soft, yet it felt heavy, laden with the weight of everything left unsaid. My breath hitched as his fingers brushed against mine, and I knew this was it, the moment everything would change. "Dad," I started, but the words died on my lips. He squeezed my hand gently, his thumb tracing small circles on my skin. "I know this feels confusing," he said, his voice low and almost soothing. "But we can't pretend anymore, can we?" I looked at him, my heart racing. His face was so close now, closer than it had ever been, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him. My mind spun, struggling to comprehend what was happening, but I felt trapped in a current, unable to break free. "We don't have to be afraid," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been feeling it too. And I think you have as well." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, my body frozen. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the truth in his words. I had felt it too. The shift, the strange connection that had grown between us over the past few days. I had tried to suppress it, to pretend it wasn't real, but here we were on the precipice of something that felt inevitable. Dad's hand slid up my arm, his touch gentle yet firm, and a shiver ran through me. My skin tingled where his fingers lingered, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His hand moved higher, brushing over my shoulder, and suddenly he was closer, his face inches from mine. "I know this is different," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I don't want to stop." My pulse raced, my mind screaming at me to move, to say something, to stop this. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body betraying me, caught in the web of tension that had been building for days. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, barely a brush of his lips against mine, but it was enough to send my heart racing. My mind went blank. the world narrowing to just that moment. The warmth of his mouth on mine, the way his hand cupped the back of my neck, pulling me closer. I should have pushed him away. I should have told him to stop, to leave, to never do this again. But instead, I kissed him back. It was as if a dam had broken. All the tension, all the confusion, everything we had been avoiding for days spilling over in that moment. His kiss deepened, his hand sliding down to my waist, pulling me closer. My head spun, my thoughts a jumbled mess, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. He broke the kiss after what felt like an eternity, his forehead resting against mine as we both caught our breath. His hand remained on my waist, his thumb tracing slow, lazy circles on my skin, and I felt like I was floating, suspended in that moment, unsure what to do next. "I don't want to lose this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't want to lose you." His words sent a pang of guilt through me, yet I couldn't deny how my body responded to him, how I felt in his arms. It was wrong, I knew that, but in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. I opened my mouth to speak, to respond, but before I could, he kissed me again. This time it was more urgent, more desperate, as if he were afraid of what would happen if we stopped. I felt his hand slide up my back, pulling me even closer, and my heart pounded in my chest. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in the moment, a small, insistent voice in the back of my mind told me to stop, to push him away, to end this before it went too far. That voice, however, was drowned out by the heat of his touch, the way his lips moved against mine, the feeling of being wanted in a way I had never experienced before. We were crossing a line, one we could never return from. I knew that. But in that moment, I didn't care. The next morning, everything felt different. The air in the house was heavy, as if holding a secret we both knew but didn't want to acknowledge. Dad was already downstairs when I woke up, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, staring out the window, lost in thought. The moment I entered the room, his eyes flicked up to mine, and for a split second, I saw a mixture of guilt and longing that made my stomach churn. Neither of us spoke as I grabbed a glass of water and sat down across from him. The silence was thick, suffocating. What had happened the night before was still fresh in my mind, and I could tell it was on his too. The memory of his touch, his kiss. It all came rushing back. My chest tightened, and I could feel the tension rising again. But I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to confront what had happened. Dad cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You sleep okay?" His voice was quiet, hesitant. I nodded, even though it wasn't true. I hadn't slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed that moment. The way his hand had lingered on my skin, the warmth of his breath against my neck, the way my body had responded to him in ways I couldn't explain. "Good," he said, nodding to himself, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. We sat there for a few more moments, the awkwardness growing with each passing second. I could feel his gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking, and it made my skin prickle with a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. I didn't know how to act, what to say to him. It felt like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, he stood up, breaking the tension. "I've got some errands to run today," he said, avoiding my eyes. Maybe we can talk later." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I just nodded, my throat tight. He hesitated for a moment longer, then grabbed his keys and headed for the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath. My mind was spinning, my emotions a chaotic jumble. What had happened last night felt like a blur, like something that couldn't be real. But it was real, and I had let it happen. Worse, I hadn't stopped it. I had wanted it. And that realization made me feel sick. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, going through the motions but not really present. Every time I thought about what had happened, my heart would race and my stomach would churn with a mix of guilt and something else I didn't want to acknowledge. I tried to distract myself, watching TV, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind occupied. But nothing worked. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. By the time evening arrived, Dad still wasn't home, and I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't ready to face him, wasn't ready to talk about what had happened. But as the hours passed, that relief began to fade, replaced by a growing anxiety. What if he didn't come back? What if he regretted everything and didn't know how to face me? The thought made my chest tighten, and I found myself pacing. The living room became my waiting room, anticipating the sound of his car in the driveway. My mind raced, 1 minute consumed by guilt and shame over what we had done, the next filled with a strange, confusing longing for the way it had felt, the way he had made me feel. It wasn't until well after dark that I heard the front door open. My heart leaped into my throat and I stood frozen in the hallway, unsure how to react. Should I go to him? Pretend everything was normal? Or should I wait for him to come to me? Before I could decide, he appeared, standing in the doorway, his expression tense. Our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us moved. The tension was almost unbearable, as if the entire room were holding its breath, waiting for something to give. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, swallowing hard. My throat felt tight, my palms sweaty, as I followed him into the living room. We sat on the couch, an awkward distance separating us, both too afraid to get too close. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. I've been thinking about what happened last night," he said finally, his voice shaky. "And I don't know what to say." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Neither do I." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It was wrong, I know that, but I can't stop thinking about it." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. My stomach flipped, and I felt my pulse quicken. "I can't stop thinking about it either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like a betrayal, yet they were the truth. I couldn't pretend any longer. Dad looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly. "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to ruin everything." The guilt in his voice was palpable, and for a moment I thought he might break down, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned forward, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. The touch was soft, tentative, yet it sent a jolt through me just like it had the night before. "I know this is wrong," he murmured, his eyes locked on mine, "but I don't know how to stop." His words made my heart race, and I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Fear, guilt, desire, all tangled up in a knot I couldn't unravel. I knew we were treading a dangerous path, one that could destroy us both. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Instead, I leaned in. What followed was a moment neither of us had planned for, yet it felt like we had been hurtling towards it all along. It was hesitant, like a word whispered in the dark, filled with confusion and longing. His hands moved to my waist, and for a brief, intense moment, we were wrapped in something neither of us could explain, something we both knew we shouldn't continue. The heat between us was undeniable, the world outside disappearing into the background. But just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. He pulled away, his breath uneven, his eyes wide with panic. We can't do this," he said, his voice shaky. "We have to stop." I nodded, my heart still pounding, my mind reeling from what had just happened. "I know." We sat there in the thick silence, the weight of what we had done pressing down on us. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. There was more. There was always more. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable tension I couldn't escape. Every moment alone with Dad was like stepping into a storm, the air charged with everything we weren't saying. I avoided him as much as possible, retreating to my room or leaving the house for long walks. But no matter how far I went, the weight of what had happened between us lingered, impossible to shake. Mom returned home the day after our last kiss, completely oblivious to the fragile tightrope we were walking. Her cheerful presence filled the house again, but instead of relief, I felt trapped. Every time she looked at me, smiled at me, spoke to me, the guilt gnawed at my insides, eating away at whatever was left of the person I thought I was. And Dad? He was distant, more so than he had ever been. When Mom tried to talk to him, he'd answer in short sentences, avoiding eye contact. I could see her concern growing with each passing day. "Is everything okay between you two?" Mom asked me one evening, her brow furrowed as she folded laundry in the living room. "Your dad's been off lately, distant. Have you noticed?" My throat tightened, panic rising in my chest. "Yeah, I've noticed," I muttered, avoiding her gaze. She sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know what's going on with him. Maybe work's stressing him out." She paused, then added, "Or maybe he's just getting older." The way she said it, with such innocent concern, made my stomach churn. She had no idea what was really happening, and I didn't have the courage to tell her. How could I? How could I ever explain that her husband, my father, and I had crossed a line from which there was no return? Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house only intensified. Dad and I barely spoke. Our interactions... The living room became my waiting room, anticipating the sound of his car. My mind raced, 1 minute consumed by guilt and shame over what we had done, the next filled with a confusing longing for the way it had felt, the way he had made me feel. I hated myself for thinking about it, for wanting it, but I couldn't stop. Then the door creaked open, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew who it was before I even saw him. Dad stepped into the room, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My pulse quickened, my body tensing as he closed the door behind him and walked over to the bed. He didn't speak, just stood there for a moment, as if waiting for permission. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I needed to see you." I sat up, my heart pounding. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he paused, then added, "but I can't help it." There it was, the truth we had both been avoiding. The confession that hung heavy and suffocating between us. I should have told him to leave, to never come into my room again. I should have pushed him away. But instead, I just sat there, frozen, my mind reeling with confusion and desire. He sat down on the edge of the bed, just like he had weeks ago, his eyes searching mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Every time I close my eyes, I see you." I swallowed hard, my chest tight with guilt and longing. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "But I don't know how to stop." His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and I felt the familiar jolt of electricity. I hated myself for it, for the way my body responded to him, for the way I couldn't pull away. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "I know," he said again, his eyes filled with a desperation that mirrored my own. "But I don't care." The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. My heart pounded, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as I stared at him, torn between what I knew was right and everything I felt. "We have to stop," I said again, though my voice lacked conviction. His hand slid up my arm, gentle but firm, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Tell me to leave," he murmured, his lips so close to mine I could feel his breath on my skin. "Tell me to go, and I will." I wanted to scream at him to leave, to never come back. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself closing the distance between us, unable to resist the pull. This time the kiss was different, more desperate, more intense, as if we both knew it was a point of no return. His hands were on me, pulling me closer, and for a moment everything else disappeared. There was nothing but the heat between us, the way his lips moved against mine. And then, well, I think you get where this is going. It's difficult to say out loud, but I'm sure you know what happened next. But as quickly as it began, it was over. He pulled away, his chest heaving, panic flickering in his eyes. "This has to stop," he muttered, his voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this." I nodded, though my heart twisted at his words. "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, his entire body tense. "I love you," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "But this isn't right." I nodded again, my throat tight, tears burning in my eyes. "I know." He turned and walked out, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving me alone in the dark. I sat there, my mind spinning, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened or what would happen next. The days that followed felt like a blur. Dad and I barely exchanged words, and when we did, it was short and awkward. The air was heavy with tension, but it wasn't the same tension we'd had before. This time, it was something we couldn't undo. Even Mom seemed to sense the shift, but she didn't say a word. Perhaps she could feel that something had fractured between us, something no one wanted to touch. The guilt lingered, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief. We had crossed a line, yes, but whatever had been simmering beneath the surface had finally broken. That suffocating tension was gone, replaced by a hollow space neither of us knew how to fill. As the weeks passed, life began to return to something resembling normal. We tiptoed around each other, careful not to cross paths for too long. The heavy silence in the house began to ease. But even as things seemed to return to routine, there was still a distance between us, a silent agreement that whatever had happened that night would never be spoken of again. Yet no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened between us wasn't truly over. Not yet. And maybe it never would be. Mom never found out, or if she did, she never said a word. In the end, we buried it. We buried everything, the kisses, the touches, the feelings that had consumed us for those few fleeting moments. We pretended it never happened, but deep down we both knew the truth. We had crossed a line we could never uncross. I curled up under the covers, pulling them tight around me. But no matter how hard I tried to close my eyes, sleep wouldn't come. Deep down I knew that what had happened between us was far from over.